Heavier above than below, the story of the Skeppet's whiskey, the ship. Many thanks to Eva Lenneman at the Swedish Spirits Museum for giving me access to the archives. On August 10, 1628, in Stockholm, more precisely in the old town below the castle of Tre Krona, a warship cast off to begin her maiden voyage. The ship was called the Royal Warship Vasa. Large crowds had gathered. Women and children were also on board. They were to disembark at Vaxholm, after which the ship would continue to Poland and the war. As the ship sailed out, a salute was fired. Near Beckholmen, the wind began to pick up. The ship started to heel. The gun ports were open and water began to pour in. The vessel began to sink. Because land was close, most people managed to swim ashore or were rescued by boats, but more than 30 people lost their lives. The accident investigation concluded that the disaster occurred because the ship was heavier above than below. For many years, this was considered Sweden's greatest national failure. Yes, all the way until the 2025 World Cup qualifiers. In 1961, 333 years later, the ship was finally salvaged. Same year Skeppet's whiskey was launched by Vin Spritcentralen, a project that would also prove to be heavier above than below. Today, almost 400 years later, we can see the Vasa less than 2,000 meters from where she sank. During the salvage operations, no whiskey was found on board, but there was Swedish vodka called brännvin and beer. Whiskey was not big in Sweden at the time. In 1870, only 2,009 karnar were imported. 1 karnar equals 2.6 liters, meaning just over 5,200 liters in total. By comparison, imports of arrack amounted to 1 million liters, and 500,000 liters each of rum and cognac. The whiskey was imported in casks, and merchants bottled it themselves and applied their own labels. Here it says "Fua skuren." That means the whiskey was cut with cheaper spirits. The purpose was to lower the price, and this practice was common for both cognac and whiskey. Cut spirits will also play an important role in the story of the Skeppet's whiskey. Here is a label from the 1880s for a whiskey from Islay called Dogen. The dog it was marketed as being suitable for toddy. But Dogen was not purebred dog, it was cut with neutral spirit. It was not until well into the 1880s that imports of whiskey from Great Britain began to increase. In 1892, advertisements announced plans to produce whiskey and arrack in Helsingborg, claiming they would be the first in the country to do so. When the Dane Gottfrid Olsen at the Gothenburg yeast factory saw this, he became outraged.
Men hvad i helvede? Jeg har jo fremstillet whisky i 4 år, og så kommer de nu og siger, at de var først.
He placed advertisements stating that they were in fact first, and that they had been producing whiskey for 4 years, but had not released it because it must be aged for at least 5 years. As early as 1872, he had travelled to Scotland, visiting Glen Scotia, Milburn, and Pulteney. He left the factory in 1893. It is known that the whiskey was not outstanding, and some of it or all was redistilled and later sold as 12-year-old grain vodka. What happened in Helsingborg remains uncertain. The only evidence suggesting whiskey production, there is a price list from Helsingborg that has Swedish whiskey. Local alcohol monopolies, so-called Systembolag, had been established around Sweden since 1850. But Stockholm created its own Systembolag in 1913 with the formation of AB Stockholm Systemet. The leading figure was Ivan Bratt. Sweden operated a liquor ration book system, known as Motbook or the Bratt system, in which every adult had a personal booklet recording and limiting monthly alcohol purchases. Stockholm Systemet bought up liquor merchants not only in Stockholm but across the country. Within a few years, Sweden had a national monopoly. This monopoly was later transferred to the state, and the company became known as Vin Spritcentralen. On August 20, 1922, Captain Otto Ballard staggered up over Fallon. He was born in Riga and was well known in aviation circles as a flight instructor. 4 days earlier, during a flight, he ran out of fuel, but managed to refill the plane with gasoline while gliding toward the ground. 2 years later, he died in Argentina during an air show. From his plane, he dropped leaflets urging people to vote no in the referendum to be held 1 week later. Prohibition had already been introduced in the United States in 1920, and also in Norway and Finland. The most famous poster opposing prohibition is this one by Albert Engström, "Crayfish demand these drinks." The image on the right shows how the proper man is reduced to drinking hair tonic and eating shoe polish. The yes side appealed to the misery and suffering that alcohol was said to cause. In the referendum, about 1.8 million people voted, and the no side won by only about 36,000 votes. Women had received the right to vote the year before. The following year, in 1923, strong beer was prohibited. Strong beer could only be sold at pharmacies with a prescription, and this ban remained in place until 1955. Wine and Spritcentralen launched 4 own whiskey brands. 2 were cut blends, and 2 contained Scotch that was only cask-filled in Sweden. The outermost brands on each side disappeared during the war. Crown Blend, launched in 1919, disappeared at the end of 1968. Standard selection existed between 1923 and 2004. During World War II, bottled imported whiskey disappeared first, followed later by cask-filled whiskey. Wine and Spritcentralen then came up with the idea of producing whiskey in Sweden. Between 1945 and 1952, just over 13,000 litres were produced on a trial basis. The Danes may have added pressure, having begun whiskey production themselves. In 1952, Danske Spritfabriker released Clock, Cuminum, Liquidum, Optimum, Castelli, the castle's finest come-in spirit. That whiskey remained on the market until 1974. In October 1955, production of Swedish malt whiskey began in Södertälje. Stills and other equipment had been purchased from Bladnock Distillery. Here we see Sven Andersson by the spirit safe. He was the father of Folke Andersson, a legend in Swedish cognac and whiskey. Folke joined Wine and Spritcentralen in 1975, after Skeppet's whiskey had already sunk. In 1955, the ration book system was abolished, and the launch of a Swedish whisky came with perfect timing. Television entered Swedish homes, showing British and American films and series where whiskey was being drunk. The salvage of the Vasa ship in 1961 gave Wine and Spritcentralen valuable publicity. Whiskey sales exploded. In 1995, Sweden joined the EU. In 2004, Swedes were allowed to bring larger quantities of wine and spirits across the border if the alcohol had been taxed in another EU country and the traveller accompanied it personally. In 2008, Pernod Ricard acquired Wine and Spritcentralen. Then COVID hit the world, people drank less in restaurants and more at home, and Swedes travelled abroad less. But back to 1961. A decision is made by Wine and Spritcentralen to launch Skeppet's whiskey. The organisation proves to be heavier above than below. There is no Swedish grain whiskey that is 3 years old. 3 options exist. Waiting 3 years is considered unrealistic. In all previous trial blends during the project, Scotch grain whiskey had been used. This option is opposed by the import department, which views Skeppet as a competitor to its own business. Instead, they choose to replace grain whiskey with neutral potato spirit. They have experience with this approach since 1919, with Crown Blend. Neither Wine and Spritcentralen nor Systembolaget informs customers of this. The label states, produced from Swedish malt whiskey made from barley malt and matured in oak casks for more than 3 years. That is only 45% of the truth. The whiskey is smoky. The site manager in Södertälje states, The somewhat more heavily peat whiskey types should be decidedly more advantageous from a temperance point of view than types with little or no smokiness, since the smoky flavor can be assumed to counteract any tendency toward more excessive consumption of this product. A remarkable statement from someone responsible for production. Skeppet is released before Christmas 1961, and everything sells out. In 1962, there are no ready whiskey. In 1963, a new recipe is released, this time using grain whiskey, but only 1.5 years old, not 3. Potato spirit still makes up the majority. A third recipe is later released. In April 1962, production begins of a new, less smoky malt whiskey, internally called the new variety. In the spring of 1963, Vin Spritcentralen goes on strike for 11 weeks. Everything that remained on store shelves is sold out. Sales never truly take off. In 1966, company management says stop. At that point, inventory consists of whiskey of the old variety, as well as 285,000 litres of new variety malt whiskey, and 400,000 litres of grain whiskey. A final recipe is launched to get rid of remaining stocks, what we would today call a blend. By 1969, inventory consists of malt whiskey of the old variety and the entire volume of new variety produced after 1962. The grain factory at Aarhus never received or heard the signal to begin producing grain whiskey, and never received the signal to stop. So production continued, adding nearly 500,000 more litres. The new variety malt whiskey was never used in Skeppet. The entire stock of the new variety malt whiskey and the grain whiskey was destroyed. I have tasted a sample of this malt whiskey produced around 1964, and it was good. Stenebro again, and thereafter, for a full 5 years, to produce a distinctly higher quality, in terms of composition and maturity, which is not permitted in any way to be presented to the public, but must instead be destroyed in its entirety. The first malt whiskey appeared in 1967, and Vin Spritcentralen cask-filled Glengrant for nearly 20 years. That same year, only 2 other single malts were available at Systembolaget, Glenfiddich and Cardew. Looking back, one can of course speculate about what might have happened if the whiskey that was destroyed had instead been launched as a Swedish malt whiskey. It would take another 30 years before Sweden developed its own malt whiskey production. Today, the situation looks entirely different. We now have several Swedish malt whiskey producers, driven by skilled and passionate pioneers, dedicated to crafting whiskey of the highest quality. Thank you for listening.